report, the Iranian regime is reportedly carrying out what some are calling the largest mass killing in Iran's modern history, as terrified eyewitness accounts describe civilians being slaughtered, not even for protesting, but simply living in the wrong place at the wrong time. What is happening in Iran tonight is a kind of evil the modern world pretends does not exist anymore. According to Pamela Geller at the Geller Report, the death toll from Iran's anti-regime uprising may have crossed into numbers that are absolutely staggering. The headline is 12,000 dead in regime massacre, Iran's largest killing in modern history. And the article cites Iran International, reporting what they describe as mass slaughter, conducted, quote, largely over 2 consecutive nights, end quote. This is not a riot situation. This is not a protest suppression. That is a purge. This is a massacre. Geller, she reports that terrifying images are emerging even under IRGC-imposed internet blackout. And I want you to think about the magnitude of what is occurring. This is a government carrying out a 2-night bloodbath against its own people because the people have dared to challenge the authority of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard. But notice something else. Geller highlights the absolute silence from the usual activist class. She writes, quote, no UN sessions, no campus protests, no street marches, no celebrity posturing. Silence, end quote. Here in America, they're screaming over ICE carrying out lawful duties, but they're saying nothing about what the regime is doing on the streets of Iran to their people. Where are all the folks that were screaming and hollering about Gaza? They're silent on Iran. Why? I believe because it does not fit the narrative. Islam is peace. It is not what the red-green axis wants to talk about because it doesn't fit their agenda. To paint Islam as, well, able to coexist inside America. Of course, that's part of the camouflage so that they can take over when the numbers are right in their favor. And the silence, as I said, is not accidental. It reveals something spiritual, I think, something ideological. Because there's a category of people in the West, especially on the progressive left, who can only recognize oppression when it fits the approved narrative, as I said. They'll flood the streets for criminals. They'll riot for Hamas sympathizers. They will scream for justice when the target is America or Israel or the Christian worldview. But when innocent people are being slaughtered by a radical Islamic regime, well, suddenly they discover some kind of nuance. Pamela Geller then references commentary about the psychological and ideological roots of the left's silence, why they often treat the enemies of the West as untouchable. She includes an important reminder. The problem is not ignorance. The problem is loyalty. This ties directly into what I have told you for years. The core battle is not merely political. It is a battle between worldviews, between, well, the worldview that says human beings are made in the image of God and the worldview that says human beings are simply tools of the state, tools of revolution, tools of power. Iran is revealing the endpoint of the revolutionary Islamic worldview. If the people rise up, the regime, they don't debate, they execute. And that's why the story matters to Americans. Because once a government believes it has the authority to rule without accountability, whether through religion, ideology, or bureaucracy, the only thing holding that government back is fear of consequences. And when those consequences disappear, well, the slaughter begins. And we're praying for the people of Iran and watching to see if indeed President Trump engages, as I think he's about to do. Now let's add another layer to that story, this time from the New York Post. It's a disturbing development. The Post reports eyewitness accounts that Iran is not merely targeting protesters. The regime is now allegedly targeting people who aren't even part of the demonstrations. The headline says it plainly. Iran is now slaughtering civilians who aren't involved in anti-regime protest. Witnesses warn. That's the headline. And when a regime transitions from hunting demonstrators to hunting bystanders, and they begin executing people simply to spread terror, that's not crowd control, folks. That is a government declaring war on its own population. New York Post, they report that witnesses are describing uniformed officers allegedly shooting indiscriminately, along with reports of patrols using unmarked vehicles to carry out executions. And this fits a pattern that we've seen again and again in totalitarian regimes. Once the government begins losing control of the streets, they begin using chaos as a weapon. Let me translate as to what that means. The regime is saying, if we can't stop the uprising, we'll make the nation bleed until the people are too afraid to move. And that's what happens under Islam when it, is fused with state power. It becomes the most perfected form of tyranny because it does not merely punish law breaking, it punishes disobedience, and it punishes thought, and it punishes hope. The New York Post, the report also notes that the death toll has surged, as we've already said tonight, into the thousands. And that estimate, it differs with some citing numbers around, 2,000. Others saying we're now at the level of 12,000. But then we have to add in all those who have been injured or imprisoned. So here's what we do know. People are dying in large numbers. The regime is escalating. The internet blackout, it's part of the operation. And the world is being conditioned to look away. And the reason the media won't cover this, like we've been at Worldview Tube, because it doesn't, as I said, fit the narrative. It doesn't fit the narrative that Iran is simply misunderstood or that it is a legitimate partner. No, this is a regime whose legitimacy is based on violence, just as is the foundation of their regime, the worldview of Islam. I want to add a story tonight that ties directly into what we've been covering, Iran, Islamic tyranny, and the ideological war against the West. Because Secretary of State Marco Rubio made comments that, frankly, you almost never hear from a major political figure anymore. Comments that I think reflect something we have said for years on this very broadcast. Islam is not merely a religion. It is a revolutionary worldview with political goals. Rubio, he said this, quote, they want to expand. It's revolutionary in its nature. It seeks to expand and control more territories and more people, end quote. That statement matters because it directly contradicts the lie that we've been fed for decades, that the problem is simply the extremist, isolated bad actors, or poverty, or lack of education. Secretary of State Rubio goes further and he says, quote, and radical Islam has designs openly on the West, on the United States, on Europe, end quote. And then he makes a point that is absolutely critical, especially as Iran's violence escalates. He says this, quote, they are prepared to conduct acts of terrorism, nation-state actions, assassinations, murders, you name it, end quote. Folks, this is reality of the Islamic revolutionary worldview, particularly in the Iranian regime model. It is not content to remain inside its own borders. It seeks global domination, a global caliphate. It seeks expansion. It seeks submission. And then Secretary Rubio makes the point that ties into the spiritual nature of this conflict. He says this, quote, that's a clear and imminent threat, especially to the United States, who they identify as the chief source of evil on the planet, end quote. Now let's translate that into plain language. When your enemy believes you are the embodiment of evil, can't negotiate your way out of that. Can't negotiate your way out of hatred. You can't use diplomacy to work your way out of that worldview. This is why the West cannot show any weakness. They cannot show compromise or moral confusion. Because when they do, it's dangerous. You see, our enemies, they're not confused. They're not debating. They're advancing. And as we've seen in Europe, when leaders refuse to acknowledge the ideology that's driving the violence, they end up importing the problem. They end up subsidizing it and then criminalizing anyone who tells the truth about it. So Rubio's comments, they're important. Not because they're radical, but because they're honest. And in a time when the truth is treated like a threat or hate crime, honesty becomes a form of resistance. And that's why this story matters tonight, why our network has stayed on it and will stay on it. Would you like to gain access to 36 years of Christian worldview programming, news and information, all my books, ebooks, documentaries, and more? Worldviewtube.com/vault. Worldviewtube.com/vault. Understand the times, where we've been and where we're going. Worldviewtube.com/vault. Well, now it's time for our nightly Worldview Report commentary. It's based on an article over at the Allgemeiner. It's entitled From Kanye to Nick Fuentes and Megyn Kelly, Why J.D. Vance's Silence Matters Now. That's the headline. And folks, the reason I want to address this is because we're in an era where, well, cowardice is being rebranded as wisdom, where silence is being rebranded as strategy, and where refusal to confront evil is being sold, well, as political maturity. But let me be very clear. There are moments when a leader must speak, not because it is convenient, not because it, well, polls well, but because moral clarity is the job description. This article, it argues that the silence matters because it creates a vacuum. And that vacuum, it gets filled by radicals, provocateurs, and opportunists. And that is what happens when leadership goes quiet, particularly on the issue of anti-Semitism. The loudest voices, they become the defining voices. Now, I'm not here to do personality politics. I'm here to talk about what the moment demands. And the moment demands that leaders say it clearly. We reject anti-Semitism. We reject the radicalism of Islam. We reject political extremism of the left, of the Marxists, the red-green axis, the black-green axis, whatever you want to call it. We reject weaponization of grievances. We reject moral inversion because if you will not confront it, you will normalize it. And if you normalize it, you'll empower it. And the reason that matters is this. The enemies of truth, they do not sleep. They do not pause. They do not take a break because conservatives are trying to be careful. They advance. The left advances their agenda through institutions, the long march through the institutions. Islamists, they advance their agenda through intimidation. Globalists, they advance their agenda through finance and surveillance. And if leaders won't speak, then the people must. And that's why we do this broadcast every day, because the world does not need more politically safe silence. The world needs truth. And that's why we're here each and every day. Truth.